Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'm going to get us started. Hi, Zuhair. Welcome to Landscaping for Beauty and Resilience. This is the annual lecture of New Canaan's Pollinator Pathway. So today's program was organized and sponsored by New Canaan's Pollinator Pathway, and this is a group that includes a lot of local organizations. New Canaan's Glass House, Grace Farms, the Beautification League, the Conservation Commission, the Department of Public Works, the Garden Club, Land Trust, this library, the Nature Center, the Norwalk River Watershed Association, Planet New Canaan, and the Waveney Park Conservancy. And we're here because without pollinators, we can't feed ourselves. The Pollinator Pathway's goal is to create a continuous pollinator-friendly corridor of private and public land throughout New Canaan to provide much-needed habitat for pollinators like bees, hummingbirds, and butterflies. But today's lecture isn't just about the right selection and balance of plants that support these pollinators. It's also about how the right landscaping enhances our enjoyment of our homes and neighborhoods, increases our property values, and builds resilience during erratic weather like floods and drought. Recognizing that landscape design is an important and often significant investment, we've invited one of the area's most successful experts to share how we can maximize our impact by designing landscapes that are beautiful and beneficial. Pennington Grey produces and maintains high-caliber, quality work on luxury properties in the Northeast, adhering to strict standards and best practices. Principal Penn Marshall is on the board of the Ecological Landscape Alliance and is known for the judicious use of native plantings and minimal chemical inputs for maximum visual and environmental benefit. Following the presentation, we'll have a Q&A, and this presentation also is being recorded. So now please join me in welcoming Penn Marshall.
Thank you all. Thank you, Mickey, for the introduction, and New Canaan Library for having me. I'll tell you a little bit about my firm, not a ton about it. Don't want to waste everyone's time. So I started Pennington Grey Landscape, which is a landscape construction firm, because of necessity. A lot of the firms that we were working with, that when I was a designer full-time, didn't have the capability or understanding of what it meant to install a native or ecologically sustainable landscape or landscape in the ways that we were asking them to. So it was born out of necessity. Since then, we've defined our mantras a little bit more clearly. We're trying to move away from traditional thinking and traditional landscaping practices, and in doing so, creating moments for the public and the users of the landscape in an intimate moment and intimate setting. A big part of what Pennington Grey does beyond the landscape side and beyond what we experience in the landscape is that we take care of our employees. Being somebody from the landscape industry, it tends to be a low-paying and low-supported industry that actually requires a lot of education and knowledge to be successful in it. So we try to provide equitable conditions for our employees and create another opportunity where you can actually get a job in horticulture and actually have a life balance where you can make a living, have a retirement, have health insurance and things like that. So all of our employees have that access to them. We have a lot of wonderful nonprofits that we work with. I didn't get to list everybody that was supporting this conference specifically, but I'm sure you're familiar with a lot of these people. This is just to say that we're well connected in the community and we like to support each other and point out. This presentation is difficult for me because I usually speak to landscape architects, engineers, and other contractors and guiding them in different techniques and principles of ecological design and how to design ecological landscapes. When I move away from that and try to curate it to the public, it's very open-ended and it's difficult for me to control everything. So I have a massive presentation with lots of beautiful photos, so hopefully that'll keep everybody engaged. One thing I will not give everybody today is what plants work at your house, because inevitably they won't, and what my favorite plants are, because they also won't work at your house. It's really important that you take the time to work with designers and contractors that you trust and are doing the right work to work on your own personal landscape. Make sure that your site is reflected properly in the plant selection as well as your needs within the landscape. So I started with this photo because this presentation is more about paths and how we access and interact with nature and specifically our landscapes. We often forget that we are surrounded by intentional design in every aspect of our lives, whether it's a public community library, whether it's driving down the highway, your own backyard. All of the things that you see growing and built were intentionally put there for a reason. And often that's restrained by budget and convenience, as you can see in a lot of public spaces, not necessarily the library, but I think a lot of you are familiar with parking lots and shopping malls that sort of have curbs and islands of mulch with trees that are sticking out of it, or acres and acres of turf grass that goes brown in the middle of August and becomes crabgrass. So today's presentation is really about how we look at nature, how we interact with nature, and how we surround ourselves. The biggest thing that comes up in my work is meadow, garden, or lawn. A lot of people in the native plant industry are sort of anti-turf and pro-native wildflower meadow, and I'm not against it. I think turf has its place in your home, especially if you have children or you like to entertain and you like close to nature but not engulfed in it. So I'm not against turf. It's just about using it judiciously and correctly for your needs within the landscape. So some basic facts that outline why I don't encourage turf as your default. So when we're designing in 2D in the office, we'll often draw plans up and we'll have these great patios and barbecue spaces and pools and things like that. And we design those intensely for that intimate experience for the user. And then sort of everything outside of that is, we just take a green highlighter and we sort of cover the area and say turf or lawn, seed at X rate. Turf should not be the default. It is the largest agricultural crop that we have in the United States. As you can see, these are all facts pulled from EPA. There's 80 million pounds of active ingredients in pesticide, which equates to 400 million pounds of pesticide put down every year. 9 billion gallons of potable drinking water gets put down on turf. It's not just golf courses, it's residents, homeowners, individuals. And then strangely enough, and I didn't realize this until I started building these presentations about 5 years ago, is that 5% of our air pollution in the United States specifically comes from lawnmowers. I'm sure everybody's heard a lot about the battery powered stuff like that. I'm not either way on it, but it was just interesting to hear that a majority of our air pollution comes from two-stroke engines, specifically lawnmowers and lawnmower use. So I don't love turf. It requires a lot of inputs. I'd rather the default go to meadows or wildflower seeded areas that are visually a little bit more chaotic, but they require much less inputs. So we're reducing our maintenance, we're reducing our mowing, reducing our water, no use of pesticides. So these things become, if this were the default, we'd be in a much better place than we are right now as far as lawn use, specifically in Connecticut too, has a very high acreage. I don't remember it off the top of my head. Meadows actually are really interesting because in the last 20, 25 years, California has been doing a lot more research about carbon sequestration. Because of the root systems in these meadow plants, they go much deeper. So just like trees sequester carbon above ground in hardwood that we use to build, plants are sequestering carbon in the form of their leaves and flowers, but also in their roots and the root systems that in some cases can go 20, 25 feet. So yeah, this should be the default. I chose this specifically because it's a very New England plant. This is Canada rye whiskey and bourbon and things like that were used to make hundreds of years ago. So comparatively, this is just statistical stuff. Don't need to go too far into it. It's pretty obvious. Seeded meadows versus turf. The reduced maintenance, no blowing, no mowing, no fertilizer, no pesticides, no irrigation. The ongoing cost is much lower. It's not zero, but it is considerably less. And I'll talk about the benefits of this, and I'll also talk about the benefits of turf. Native spaces and native plantings have year-round interest, and if you're co-planting in a wild matrix that looks chaotic, it gives way to these gorgeous seasonal blooms and these flashes of color at different times of the year. So this makes it really a much more entertaining thing. Personally, I'm partial to the winter side, which gets a lot of these buff and nude and silver colors and black. And because we have so much winter and fall in New England, this is how we see these plants for a majority of the year. And this is how we identify them. It's between the flowering and then when they senesce and they go dormant, that's when we're most familiar with them. Also habitat. Nothing lives in lawn, but a lot of stuff uses native wildflowers. I love this photo because of the adorable handcrafted little birdhouse sticking up out of the middle of a meadow. Habitat is everywhere. Bugs are everything. As Mickey mentioned, without pollinators, we lose a lot of food pollination. In fact, 33% of all of our food consumed in the world is produced by pollinators. So habitat is a good thing. I know deer is the bane of existence of almost every homeowner or landscape lover in Connecticut, specifically New Canaan. There are a lot of deer, and how we how we live with these animals that impact how we appreciate them is an important part of the landscape and how we make choices with plants. Also, native plants, this is more popular in the last 5 to 10 years. Native plants as green infrastructure. I mentioned the root systems. They all have different structures, different sizes, different shapes, and different ways that they move through the soil, how they break soil up. Using native plants as green infrastructure actually means that instead of heavy rains hitting lawn and then sheeting off into a street, into a drainage system, further burdening our stormwater systems on a municipal level, the water actually hits the ground and permeates into the soil and percolates down into the ground and refreshes aquifers and groundwater recharge. Using it in that respect is really cool, and there's tons of really interesting details about how you can use native plants. This is not my image, wonderful representation of why turf doesn't work as a green infrastructure solution in your yard. The roots on the far left with the red arrow are turf roots. So we're talking anywhere from 4 to 6 inches deep, whereas the perennials in your garden or in a native system can reach 20, 25 feet deep. So that's why they do really well when it's hot and dry. They don't require as much nutritional fertilizers. They don't require water because their roots are looking for it. I love this. I think it leads really well into this. I worked on a project years ago, probably 10 years, 15 years ago, where the client said they really love the lake that they live on and they want to preserve it and work with it. But this just didn't seem like it made a lot of sense because all the water just kept raining and it would just rivulet into the... So the solution was a native wetland buffer. And this was a seeded and live project. And what this does now is when water sheets off the lawn from the house and the gutters, it hits this native planting. And it doesn't all stop there, but I'd say you're not seeing the water move into the lake with immediacy without the pause. So at least we're getting some recharge and some percolation there. I included this because in the last 2 or 3 years, I don't know if anybody's noticed, the rainstorms and windstorms that we've been getting are like outrageous, specifically in Connecticut. We're getting windstorms that are taking down trees that have been up for 150 to 200 years. We're getting washout that is eating away backcountry roads, overwhelming culverts, flooding your backyards, and that's all because climate change, so that's related to what we plant, but it's also related to how we're managing water on our sites, and we're not really prepared for these heavier rains that we're getting 3 to 6 inches of rain in a day, and then it's drought. So we're not prepared, and we need to be thinking about things differently, and we can't use the same traditional things that we've been doing in the landscape for the past 35 years. We need to mix it up. This isn't the solution, but this has been the default. 100 years ago, this was really amazing because that showed that you had the wealth to have someone pruning this grass by hand or with a very expensive machine. At this point, this is the default for every commercial and public space throughout America. It leads to all the problems and all the washout and all the issues. This is your alternative when you hit the strip mall and you have to go shopping at a big box store. This is what it looks like. This is doing nothing for water. It's doing nothing for infrastructure. It's not habitat. It's not really providing shade. It's not really doing much for anybody. It doesn't really do much for me visually either. This is an alternative. This is native plants. It's habitat, it's beautiful, and it manages the water. This is the project from Grace Farms. We did all the parking lot islands. This is a great example of what it could be. It doesn't have to be mulch and grass. It does require maintenance, just a different level and a different type. It's not mowing every week. It's well-educated, competent staff going out every other week or once a month, editing and weeding appropriately and knowing which plants to weed and which plants not to weed. So I spoke about rain and washout, and this image is actually from this year. I've dealt a lot of the phone calls and a lot of the stuff that we've been fielding as a construction firm this year has been yard drainage, road washout. This road, the client wanted to repair and elected not to restore the culvert system or do anything else other than redo the road that washed out previously a month before this photo. We replaced the road, we repaired it. It was very expensive. We recommended that they do more than that. They chose not to, and this is what happened, I think, 3 weeks after we finished. Yeah, so there's alternatives to that. And that's what I'm here to suggest. This is a project. Obviously, this is much more established. It wasn't like day one that we put the driveway in and it looked like this. This is a 3 or 4 year old meadow. That meadow is 6 to 8 inches below the driveway, and the driveway is crowned. The meadow handles all the water. It's dry to walk in. It's not a concern. This is, I think, end of August, so it is smoking hot and 95 degrees out, and there's no irrigation, and it is the luscious part of the property. We've been doing a lot more stuff in the country where people put new homes in and they're like, this is the culvert system we have. We're actually here with another great landscape architect that brought us in to solve the problem. And the problem is sort of a weedy mess managing water, which was causing backups in their drainage system, et cetera, et cetera. This is what it looked like. So without a heavy design intention or without a large infrastructure change, strategically placed stones and some proper grading and putting, you can't see them now, but they're small live plants, these plugs that are all native along the edge of it that are suited for those conditions. We solved the water problem, and you can see that the seasonality is not that different. This is midsummer, this is fall, the previous fall, and next year later. So we're managing the water. It looks cool, and it looks natural, and it's kind of forgettable, but that's actual native infrastructure at work. This leads me into commercial solutions, and I say that because we're in a library, this is a public space, and I think a lot of you all have yards and you have your own personal space, but it's tough to remember that like everywhere we look is intentional design, and someone made the decision to do that. So having you all more aware of it so you can comment on it and bring attention to it, and when you're involved in the community, not default to grass. Corporate parks, office parks, they don't have to be grass. No one's using this space. It's awesome space. I kind of wish that these would also double as like playing fields for kids, because that would be really cool. After work gets out, everybody goes to the corporate office to play soccer, but that's not what happens right now. So one of the projects I chose to highlight was one actually not in New Canaan, it was in Norwalk, where we worked with a local New Canaan landscape architect, West Stout Associates. They recently were awarded an ASLA, which is American Society of Landscape Architecture, specifically to Connecticut. They won an award for this project because it was their innovative use of green infrastructure and native plants within a commercial landscape. So this is the befores, and that's just for shock and awe, because a lot of these projects take 5 years, 3 years to grow out. So if I showed you day one, you'd just be like, okay. This project had a combination of two solutions, which was live plants for some intentional immediate vegetation to help with runoff and washout. And then we also seeded the entire area with native plants, similar species in a similar mix. This is the first year out. You can see along the edge, all this vegetation is gorgeous. These were the live plants, so that the user has this intimate experience of walking along the walkway and has this vegetation and beautiful plants that are structured correctly. There's form, there's function. They're also native habitat for insects. And this bleeds into a seeded meadow, which is gorgeous. I mentioned I really like winter photos. I think winter really shows off plants' mature structure, as well as their seed heads, how their flowers are finished. So you have this wonderful skeletal image, but very architectural at the same time. Again, this was 3 years after building it, 4 years after building it. The photos were great. I loved it because it was a winter photo shoot, and usually you go out as landscape designers and contractors, and we're like, come to my property on June 1st. I know this is going to be in bloom, and it's going to be gorgeous, and everyone's going to see it. And everybody looks at social media, and it's like hydrangeas and alliums and all this gorgeous stuff. The project is in Norwalk, so it's technically in a floodplain as far as we're considered if we're looking at the project from 150 miles up in the air. So it's a grassland, so it's a beach, duney grassland within a mile of the ocean on Long Island Sound. And there is a ton of birds that use this space. The owners commented, they said this, at first they were like, oh my God, what did you do to my place? It looks terrible, it's just a weedy mess. And everyone was like, just wait. And then now we get comments that are like, this is the coolest thing ever. I saw this bird in the morning, and it's all the staff are looking out and they're like, oh, did you see that one this morning? Yeah, but it's a really gorgeous project. It came out beautifully. Everything in the foreground here is all from seed. So the same as we seed turf, we can seed meadow. It's just a matter of, we don't mow it every day. You have a strategic approach on how you maintain it to keep it looking like that. They got rid of 90% of their turf on their property. They eliminated a $30,000 to $40,000 a year mowing contract, and now they're just left with this, which to me is pretty awesome. No one's playing soccer in it, but this project also had a really interesting component to it. You can see in the background, there's also a rooftop. As you move out through the landscape, there's a bridge actually that goes to a rooftop, and that's one of their warehouses. So this was an opportunity to take a warehouse that's housing industrial equipment, and it didn't need to be heated or cooled as much, but we put a rooftop garden on it, and that reduced the need for heat and cooling by putting insulation on it, as well as drainage board, so it was full circle. Again, in this iteration, because it's going to be used by the staff of the building, we wanted the space to feel a little bit more like a landscape and less like a grassland, because it's now going to be inhabited by employees and by animals and insects and birds. So again, the plant palette we chose was we walked, we literally went out to the water's edge to some of the public beaches on Norwalk, and we looked what's growing here, what's native, and what wants to be here. So the planting palette is made up of junipers, of birches, of amelanchier, and hawthorns, and that's about it. And then it's just the grassland underneath that. The comparison of this really awesome high-use space where you have like mini golf, barbecue areas, dining areas, fire pits, right up against something that could be used by a bird or an insect or something like that is really cool. And the whole thing is completely artificial on top of a building. So you have this very natural element right up against these very synthetic elements, and that's pretty awesome. My point is to how we interact with nature and how we bring nature into our living spaces and how close we can bring it to your living space so that you can appreciate it, but from afar where you don't feel like you're being overwhelmed by it or eaten or swallowed up by it. Yeah, so this is a gorgeous park. It's actually really special when you're up there. I don't have a photo of it, but when you're up there, you can't see the parking lot. You're in a native woodland along the... So this was a great solution. What design is about innovation and problem solving, and I don't really think of myself as a specific landscape designer. We sort of are problem solvers. We want to know what the issues are, what the problems are, and can we solve those problems with plants? If we can't, we may make a recommendation. So one of the problems here was they had a lot of parking lot and they had no green space in it, and they didn't know what to do about it. This is a recycling company, so they had tons of recycling dumpsters and containers and things like that, and the solution was, why don't we use some of these containers to plant habitat and move them around the parking lot as we see fit and put them where we want to, so that if you have the need for moving them, you can get them out of the way so large shipments and things can come in, but then they can go back to their space. Thought process, we worked with Color Blends in the fall, which is a Connecticut-based company that does bulbs. They gave us their old plastic containers that they recycle anyways, and we use them as a drainage. So that's a water holding containment in the base of a planter made out of a dumpster. We put insulation to separate it, cores in it, put a fast draining soil in it, and then we put native plants in it. And this is all in December. They're not irrigated. That reservoir that we built out of recycled bulb containers holds water, and when the plants need it, eventually get down there, capillary effect, they pull the water up into the soil. It's actually really cool too, because the soil in the middle of the summer will pull about 8 inches off the side of the dumpsters. So you have these mature 15-foot tall trees in it, and the soil is just contracted really heavily, and then it swells back up in the fall and spring and winter. So I thought this was a really innovative, fun solution to getting native plants in a parking lot in an industrial and commercial setting. As you can see, there's a loading dock right behind it, and usually you just have mulch piles. You should comment and notice like how people are choosing to use plants and landscape to dictate your experience in that space. We had a great opportunity to work with a client that had a wonderful home. They had renovated. They had already worked with a landscape architect and done some interventions that they wanted to see on their property, which would be at their front door, at their parking court, out back around the patio. They put a veggie garden in, they had the tennis court, and then they had a formal garden out back on the other side. And then they had 5 acres because what else do you do except grab your green colored pencil and say, this is lawn. They came in to talk to me and they said, what can we do? We love native, we love plants, we love birds, we love nature. That's why we bought this place. We're perched up on a hill and like surrounded by woodlands. So I highlighted here all the areas that were turf, and we sort of talked about, they have children. We talked about how they use the space, how they move through the space, and the solution was, let's eliminate some of this turf area. We don't need, 5 soccer fields throughout the whole space. And these projects not drag on, but most people like to have an intervention where they're like, all right, great, I'm done. Day one, we pay you money, it's done, and you walk away. We've been there for 4 or 5 years, and every year we break off a different part of this turf, and again, we did another section this year, which I'll bring you to. The first section was right next to the vegetable garden. It was sort of this dead space. I'm not a purist. I'm not a purist for natives only. I think natives play a really important role, but there's no reason that we can't have a little bit more beauty and things that we as people are attracted to that are non-native. We designed in the field, we made a plant list, we bring all the plants out, we lay everything out. I really love the use of alliums, are non-native, and that's the big global poofs along the way, but we nestle them in between native sedges, which act as habitat for insects, salamanders, and things like that, because they flop down and they cover the ground, so they're weed suppressing, but then they also create these cool little environments for ephemeral amphibians and things like that need to nestle underneath there and go to sleep for the winter. So this is just a lot of beautiful pictures of this garden coming in. A lot of it is native, but there are some non-natives, like right in the foreground is like Russian sage, just a crowd pleaser. There's salvia and things like that, but everything else blooming in white and yellow and that's tall and green is native. So it's about, this garden's 90% native plants, viewed and experienced by the user as a formal traditional garden. And so we sort of made like a, cottagey garden. The grasses are native to the US, but they're not native to Connecticut specifically. It's actually called Mexican feathergrass, but it has a great texture and catches the light beautifully, so I had to use it. This is that allium I was talking about, nestled in native sedges. This whole area is native, and it's just a beautiful combination. So yeah, this was the first intervention on the property. They had this massive rock, which they didn't know what to do, and it wasn't the clients themselves, it was other landscapers and other landscape architects that we weren't sure what to do with it, so we covered it with some soil and put some grass seed on it and then irrigated it really heavily so that it would stay green in July and et cetera, et cetera. The first thing we did was rip all that off and expose this awesome rock that they had right at their front door, whereas everybody else was trying to hide it and didn't know how to deal with it. That's part of problem solving, is embracing your problems and sometimes highlighting them as a design feature. So that was our first innovation, and we got rid of a large section of grass. They also wanted to do something more formal, entry to the vegetable garden. I don't have a photo of it because we actually ended up changing it later. They were really jazzed about the idea of having the formal allée of privet hedges and hydrangeas with alliums popping up in between, lined with boxwoods, which we did, and it was actually gorgeous. As we progressed with the client, we realized we want to do more. The next step that we did after that first garden was the front yard. I obviously took a photo of it when it looked worse, because it was lawn prior to this, and they were mowing it, and I said, don't mow it, let's grow it out and see what it looks like. So this is their front lawn. This is their driveway entry, and our choice was to convert it to meadow plants. So obviously the first year meadow plants is really gorgeous because it's always a flush of annuals and yellows and purples and blues and whites. And as it has matured, it's gotten more dynamic and more interesting. Hopefully this year we'll get some new photos of it. This was just last spring, a year after we did it. So the whole front yard looks like this. And so everybody was really jazzed the first year, and there's like, yep, that was a much better choice than So the homeowner actually bought some meadow seeds too, and you can see these tall pink Cosmos are annuals, they're non-native, but he threw them in the landscape and they actually work really well. I really like this because it illustrates the backdrop to a formal garden, and instead of just having, again, this blanket of we have a formal garden with non-native plants in it that it's just as gorgeous, but then you just throw meadow in the background. Nobody's playing soccer on it, it's on a slope. Everybody that walks by gets to appreciate it. We chose to get rid of more turf. And this garden, this one is a work in progress. We didn't finish it yet. So we got rid of, I'd say, the largest chunk of turf last spring, and we laid out two grasses. We used Deschampsia cespitosa, which I'm trying to think of, I'll try to think of the common name, and Sprobolus, which is prairie dropseed. So it's these two grasses that finish at about 16 feet tall. They poof up, and their seed heads come up in the Deschampsia comes up now and will be in full flower in these little cloudy tufts, and the Sprobolus does the same thing, but they do it in August. So you have these two variations of it, and then we mingled these two flowers together, and I'll get a photo of it this year and then non-native bulbs. I think bulbs really help people appreciate a new landscape intervention earlier. Daffodils have naturalized here over the last 150 years, so I'm okay using them. And also it just looks, so this was the first look at this year, photos from this spring that we just did. So the area that we're talking about is over by the other rock on the other side, that big patch. That's gonna be a grass meadow that ties into it. The lower section down by the road on the far right, that's the front meadow. So we've gotten rid of most of it. They added a pool this year, and then between the pool and the vegetable garden is all going to become a garden now. They took the lawn thing and got rid of it. So here's another property that I refer to as Wild Edges. Already before I started working with them, I already viewed a lot of the landscape as useless because he didn't really walk in that space and sort of just let everything grow up. So everything outside of the family's core use of the lawn pool area was just sort of let go. And it looked cool enough, it works. I think it's pretty enough. So there's certain areas where we prioritized high use, high visibility, low use, low visibility, and we had different interventions for each area. This is a low use area, but a high visibility. So what you see there is, before we've done any interventions, is we have daisy fleabane coming up, which is a non-native opportunistic disturbance species, which is a really cool plant. If you ever want to nerd out, check it out. Anytime the soil's disturbed, this guy hangs out in the soil and waits to jump up, shoots up, puts out 1 million seeds, and goes away. It's not really a weed per se, because I think it's pretty and it doesn't really impact the ecological evolution of anything. So we sort of, we let it be. Next to the vegetable garden, near the tennis court, at the parking court, there were some other opportunities to be had. This was named the Wild Patch, because when I showed up, that's what it looked like. And the homeowner was like totally cool with it. And he's like, I just want to do something different. Can you do something different here? This was the first iteration of it. And what I recommend to a lot of people is let your lawn grow, see what happens, because sometimes just letting your lawn grow, you can see how much you can tolerate the disorder or disarray of a landscape. And then you can say, yeah, maybe that could be something more wild. So I say, don't mow it. See what it looks like, see how you like it. We chose to turn this into more of a perennial garden because it's a smaller area, it's more intimate, they're in it every day because the vegetable garden's right there. They walk from the parking court through this garden. So we laid it out, got rid of all the grass, laid it all out, and this was the first year. Again, I'm not a purist, so you'll see a lot of things that are non-native like salvias and digitalis and things like that, but this one's about 70% native plants. So its habitat, we found actually, begrudgingly so, found baby rabbits in there the next year that was eating everything, but this is a great combination. This is a white liatris, which is native, with a hybridized white echinacea in the background, which is a native, just a hybrid version of it, intermingled with a non-native, which is called stachys, which is in purple. It just looks really beautiful, and I think the use of natives, non-natives is totally allowable. I like to include this because things look a little ratty. Yep, again, same thing. There's some non-natives, natives, just beautiful flowers, gorgeous gardens. It gives way to this really wild fall in this garden. We have a couple asters that just get huge and then get weighed down by the dew and flop all over the place. So they create these big purple mounds throughout the garden with a couple of white anemone that we stuck in to highlight and give some structure. Obviously, it looks much better in the middle of the summer with a professional photographer taking a photo of it. Again, it's about pathways, how we access the natural environment, how we interact with these native plants. This is just a small curated walkway. The homeowner likes to put some annuals in that are non-native, but it's really cool to have wild meet really formal. We also did a small intervention where they didn't use part of the property, so we blocked it off with a native birch grove. The same birches that are used out here actually on the patio of the library, and we did them as, this is 3 years later, we did them as very small plants that were about 8 feet tall, and we planted them very close together, and then we underplanted with ferns. So it creates a wall and a stop so you don't go back to the rest of the property, but you could walk through if you wanted to. We did this property in the same way as we did the other one, where we've been there for 6 years now and still going, where we started with the wild edges that they let grow, and they were like, okay, this one we can change, and then it was like, wow, that was successful, let's do more of it. So we went to the other side of the property, and they have this gorgeous pin oak that is in the backyard, and when I got there was just, this was perfect mowed lawn all the way through and through. So we took this area and we started at the oak, and then we ended up working our way all the way down the yard over the next 2 years. So we started with that bench in the oak, and it was a small bed, and that looked really pretty, and then we just brought it all along the side here. The oak garden is a shade garden. It's got natives, but we also used Caryopteris, which I don't know the name of colloquially, but it's a beautiful purple and blue flower, and that's sort of that shrubby mound, and then underneath that is all native woodland species. So it's a very intimate garden. When you go and sit there and pause, you can look back at the whole yard, and if you look to your left or right, you can see these very diminutive special plants that are ephemeral that pop up. And then as we come out from the oak tree, it got very sunny and hot, so we named this area the Prairie. So we used all Wisconsin prairie as inspiration, and we chose native plants to New England, which included a lot of Echinacea pallida you can see floating above the grasses. It looks very chaotic in person. It's really delicate and beautiful. The Echinacea pallida is above everything, and it's a really beautiful view to look through. This also created an opportunity where they had a low spot behind this that you can't see, and the neighbors is literally 20 feet from the front of that bed. And you can't see the neighbors because all these grasses are 3 feet tall, 4 feet tall, so it's acting as a wall and privacy. And then this is behind the garden, where we have more native prairie plants, and back here, everything is actually a tall grass prairie, so everything's gonna get 6 to 7 feet tall in August. And we have this narrow little pathway that nobody in the family uses except for the homeowner, and he really likes it, and he'll go and walk through that path and, you know, run your hands through the grass seed heads, and it's very private and special. So it's again about the pathways and how we interact with nature, how we get close to it. And these grasses are just getting going, and they're already probably 4 feet tall. Off this, we had another section that we wanted to do that was a little bit more part shade. So this is another intervention where we wanted something a little bit more tame, because it's right off the house, it's right off the patio. It's one of the gardens that visitors access and visit. So we used a little bit more non-natives in this area and a lot more allium. I think allium is a good way to connect with people visually. I think everyone recognizes them and they're like, oh wow, that's really beautiful, having them pop up and float over. The other way I like to use non-natives is with bulbs. You saw my use of daffodils. We also use a lot of tulips in our gardens. You sometimes have to be replanted every year, but I think it's a great way to segue from spring until summer. A lot of the spring plants in New England the spring native plants are not as aggressive and can't compete with other plants. So they're really good in woodlands and in settings where there's no vegetative competition. But otherwise, if you use them in the garden, they're going to get lost or beat up by other bigger, more mature plants. So using bulbs and tulips and things like that that are off color is a nice way to bring color to the springtime of a native garden and get people engaged earlier on. Again, it's closer to the house. We wanted it to be more formal and tame. So everything in that garden is maximum maybe 16 inches tall. Other thing that we used on this property was the use of green mulching. Green mulching is kind of a ubiquitous term in our industry where someone says instead of putting down wood chips, you can put down plants, ideally native plants. There's a slew of native plants that do really well in the shade that cover and suppress weeds. Here we used Heuchera americana along all the edge here. I think it's called Dale's strain or something like that. But we did them in plugs, and 3 years later, they're big, 24 to 36 inch wide, round, moundy things. So this was a mulch ring around a crabapple tree, which we turned into green mulch. I'm going to segue into smaller gardens because a lot of these projects are like, okay, yeah, well, I'm not going to redo my entire landscape, and I'm not going to I'm not going to remortgage my home to redo my lawn, and that's totally totally understandable. So this example of garden is a smaller intervention in a garden, a landscape. This is actually not in New Canaan, this is in Rye, New York. There's a series of houses and homes, and you can see as far as your eye can see, everybody has the same 18-foot wide strip of grass that borders the street. And that goes from both sides, and it's 4 streets wide and 8 streets long. This homeowner's like, I want to do something different, and I don't see the purpose to this. So we kept the grass because they wanted the formality and they wanted to show their neighbors that this is intentional, and we wanted to do it. So we kept a 24-inch strip of grass around it. And then we filled it with native plants. I don't have great shots of it because we didn't get to go back to see it in full bloom. And so it looks a little like unwieldy in different heights and stuff like that. But I assure you, everything will grow together and it creates this big, gorgeous, massive stuff. This is the coolest thing on a street because the entire neighborhood is just grass and everybody's like total turf nuts. And I'm like, what are you going to do with 18 feet of grass next to the street? Are your kids going to go play soccer there? It's just the default. This wasn't terribly expensive. I don't remember the cost, but it was not I was actually shocked. I was like, oh, that's not that bad at all. And this got 19 native species in it, but it grew in beautifully and got big, and everybody stopped by every time we maintained it for the years going on, and everybody that walks the neighborhood goes, oh my God, I love this garden. It's always changing so much. It's so cool. And I'm like, you could do it too. And they're like, no. Small gardens are great. This is over in Rowayton. This is year 1 of this garden. And you can see, again, in the background, everyone else did the same thing. A panel of grass on a slope retained by a hill. No one can use that grass. No one's sitting out there. No one's playing out there. You're not going to sit with a glass of wine or a cup of coffee and stand out in your 20 by 20 patch of grass and go, boy, this is fantastic. So we had a really great client that was excited to do something different in their front yard. They're like, I hate grass. Why do we have to have grass? So they were like, let's do native plants. So this big block on the left is Amsonia. It's one of my favorite. It turns neon yellow in the fall. It also has light blue flowers in the spring. And then Echinacea, again, it's a hybridized version, so it's white. Non-native Russian sage, and in the background, I think we have lavender actually, because that's right by the carport, and they like to get out, and it's nice to have the wafting. That's what they did with their front yard instead of grass. 12 blue stones and some gravel, and like 90 perennials. Really cool. And they actually threw some Adirondack chairs out there. They have a little solo wood fire stove, so they actually can hang out in their front yard. All this is to say that it doesn't matter the shape or size of the garden it is, whether it's commercial, whether it's residential, whether it's big, whether it's small, whether you do your whole yard now or you do a garden every year for the next 25 years. It doesn't really matter. The idea would be to start everything with the right intention. And that means working with designers that one, will listen to you and not just push their agenda. Embrace the idea of native plants. Doesn't have to be purist, because I feel like that's limiting into itself. I think you lose a lot of the design aesthetic. And also that want to design for how you use your garden. I think a lot of designers design gardens and landscapes to be viewed from afar. And I think it's really important that we connect with our landscape and connect with the natural world. A lot of the time it's viewed from a patio, and I think that's perfectly fine, but it'd be nice if you could do what I always say when we start the design project. I say, where do you drink your coffee? And where do you do your quote-unquote gin and tonic walk, where you get home from work and you want to disconnect and take a break before you go inside to the next chaotic part of your life? Like, what do you do, and what does that walk look like? So it's really dictated by humans and how we use the environment. And if people aren't asking you, like, how do you live your life in your house, it's probably not a designer you want to work with, because they're not actually going to listen to you or curate your environment to your use. Doesn't mean we can't change. I think that's what makes the natural world fun. So this last project was nice because we started with the intention of we wanted the least amount of impact and want the site to, the only impact was just the immediate use functional spaces, which meant the house, the pool, the parking court. This client happened to have 2 children that like to play volleyball, and a patch of grass. So those were our requirements for this project. And you can see the patch of grass is there, their pool's there, their house is there, and their parking court's there. And everything else we planted with native species. This is 100% native landscape. It was a really fun project because before the house got built, we got involved. And we're part of the process for designing it. This, I nerd out on it because there's like all these different environmental, ecological levels where it's like you have an oak forest, and then we brought birches in because they're early successional species, which means like a meadow would give way to birches, and birches give way to oaks and maples, and so on, so on. So in 150 years, this will probably be an oak forest swallowing up this little house. In the interim, it's a birch forest. So this was day one when we planted the birches, and this was a better part of 5 or 6 years ago at this point now. This is what it looks like now. This is at their front door. The front door is right to my right. So this is what they walk up to every day. The whole point of this house was to have the house be a sanctuary and to have the most minimal impact on the natural world and bring the natural world right up to the edges and sort of swallow everything up. And that's what we did. We have seeded meadow that swallowed up all the space right up to the edge of the patio. It photographs beautifully. It's also really intimate when you sit there. They have a fantastic view until the plants get really tall and they can't see the view, and then I get these text messages of plants and no view, and they're like, could you stop by and trim this down a little bit? And we happily do. But yeah, it was really about connection to natural world and natural environment. So everything was swallowed up by, this is what that looked like before we even got involved. So again, we were early on in construction and we were able to dictate what happened. I like to pause in this photo for one reason is because the site had a lot of rock. One of the things on the table was if you've ever built a house or a landscape or something is like, oh my God, you got to pay $30,000 to haul rock off your site so that we can throw it out. And we said, what if we take some of the boulders and we're going to place them strategically in the meadow and give some structure. And then below the pool, we're going to take all your scrap rock, all your gravel and garbage, and we're going to dump it there. And of course, the builder's like, that's awesome. And the homeowner's like, are you serious? And I was like, no. What we're going to do is we're building a rock outcropping. So there's probably 60 yards, like 3 dump trucks worth of gravel and stone below the pool there that built it up about 4 or 5 feet tall. And then we dusted in topsoil over the top of it. And it creates this very, what we call like depauperate or deprived environment. So it's very hot and dry. So the plants actually now are very small. The first year out, they were a little bit taller, but they're smaller than the other plants. So this whole area is like this hot, dry rock outcropping. So there's only a small number of plants that survive here, and they tend to be shorter. And so it was a really good use of creating our own artificial but natural environment. And again, it saved money and it allowed them to pay for the plants that they put there. Yeah, starting with intention and design intention from the get-go makes the process a lot easier, and you can make a lot better decisions. Again, no turf, very small area, and that's for the kids and the dogs. And then everything else. Granted, they got rid of forests so that they could have views, but they put back native plants. Always going to come back to it. Pathways, how we interact with nature. This is an outdoor shower. There was a lot of discussion about how do we get to the outdoor shower, and the first iteration was large stone pavers, and we go out to we're all patio. And we're going to go to the shower and back to the house without touching anything. After some back and forth, we all sort of said, hey, why don't we have like this narrow wooden path, sort of like you're walking through like a woodland wetland, so you can be barefooted. It's soft on the feet. That path is only 18 inches wide, so it's just for one person. It's very private. And then, again, woodland plants, sedges, ferns. These are native azaleas all around the space. The woodland walk is Ipe, and it's underlit with LEDs. So in the evening, you can still go out there and shower. But this was a really fun intervention the whole theme was getting closer to nature without being overwhelmed by it at the same time, so you can be in your built environment right adjacent to nature. Probably one of my favorite outdoor showers. Again, the theme of the building was really cool architecturally too. The architect was involved heavily in the whole concept. The whole building was painted with pine sap and pine tar, so it's not paint, it's a natural ingredient, and it was sealing the cedar up. We got rid of railings, and you can see the neon. Well, you can't really see very well in the projection, but on the right-hand side is a cliff that drops off to the backyard, and we used red twig dogwoods to line it, so that's the barrier. So it's this thick barrier blocking you from going off the edge. Later on, again, we stay involved for a very long time. They said we want to put a garage in case we have visitors, and it's difficult to park all the cars in the parking court. They had made the decision where they're going to put the parking garage before I got involved, and I was like, okay, that's fine, but they're like, we still want to do the same thing. We want it minimally invasive. We want things to look low touch. And I was like, cool. So I go out there, and what had they done? They cut a hole in the side of the mountain. And I was like, well, it's not really low touch. And he's like, well, can you make it look normal again? So that was the site we showed up on. And I was like, I don't know if we can really do that. But we tried our best. And again, I just default to meadow. What you don't really see is there's a couple of taller twigs in the background with green leaves on them. We brought seedling oaks in. Again, we were trying to be budget friendly, and we wanted things to survive here, so we brought baby oaks and baby maple trees and seeded meadow. So over the next 25 or 30 years, it's going to reforest right up over onto the edge of the garage. We don't have to put big trees in. It's not a high priority area. If those trees don't live, it's $25. It's not a big deal. We can replace them or get another one. We don't have to put a $2,000 tree right on the garage. But the first year looked really well. I think we hit the directive pretty well. I probably rushed through things because I actually cut this presentation down, and I took out a few projects because I tend to have a few hundred slides because I'm like, that's pretty, that's pretty, that's pretty. My main thing is innovative solutions that are based in ecological ideas. Native plants, water infrastructure that can be solved with plants, issues that can be solved with plants, whether it's a green roof, or if it's a bigger shade tree next to a driveway, or a properly placed tree that's in bloom in the middle of summer to add shade and cool weather to your patio. My big thing is like how you guys use your lawns and what your needs and wants are. I think turf has its place. A lot of people like to hang out in turf. I, for one, love to be out walking through the grass, and I think that's a really fun way to like stand in the middle of a grass area and flop down on a hot summer day. I think that's fun. Big thing that I like to impress on people is paths. And the background areas to your landscapes need to be grass. They can be just let them grow up, or they can be turned to meadow plants. And then mowing paths through them to get you out to different locations, and then you can create these little pocket gardens. I've said it like a dozen times, recognize the landscape is designed and it's everywhere in our lives. Mulch alternatives, I have a whole presentation that's dedicated to mulch alternatives where we just, it's like, and this plant, and that plant, and this plant. A mulch alternative is just more plants. Native, non-native, more plants, less mulch, saves you money. The return, monetarily speaking, the return on investment for mulch versus plants is 3 years of mulching equates to planting that area. So if you can take your 3-year mulch budget and you can suffer it 1 year, you're gonna have, you'll have no mulch moving forward, but you will have some weeding to do. Use native plants when you possibly can. Again, work with designers that understand what we're doing and why we're doing it.
Does anybody have questions?
Big fan of your work. I love it. I have a few questions, but I'll just ask one and then maybe someone else will go. So you mentioned in your meadow projects, both large scale and small scale, you mentioned removing the grass. I know that can be kind of a tough process. What do you guys do for that? It looked like maybe there was a backhoe, some sort of backhoe. Could you?
I do use pesticide in my work because it's tends to be cost effective. So in some scenarios, we'll go in and we'll spray a non-selective herbicide, which means it doesn't select one plant or the other. It just kills all vegetation in that area. That tends to be the most cost effective way to get rid of turf or some of these other invasive things. That project was an organic project, so the alternative was bringing in heavy equipment and stripping the topsoil off, or not stripping the topsoil off, stripping the sod and turf off of it. And you can also use sod cutters and things like that. I personally like to kill the vegetation with herbicide. I know it sounds very antithetical to everything that I talk about, but it's much more cost effective, and we don't have to worry about machinery. We don't have to worry about then disposing of the grass that you've ripped out, because that's got to go somewhere too. And you actually can have a better soil profile because you don't move heavy equipment. You don't have as much compaction. So I prefer to kill it, and then you can just sort of string trim it down and get rid of all the dead vegetation. And then you can seed into it or plant into it or rototill it or whatever you want to do to prepare that space. Very laborious to cut sod out because that stuff's heavy.
So we have an area that we took down some trees that have died, oak and beech. You can't take any machinery in, and it's being invaded by garlic mustard, stiltgrass, and raspberries. Yep. What do you suggest?
I always get this question. Yours is actually is interesting. There's a lot of analysis you need to do in the site. With losing those kind of big mature canopy trees that make up a mature forest, I would imagine that area is really sunny now. In that case, the garlic mustard and the stiltgrass actually don't like full sun. So if you didn't do anything over the next 3 to 5 years, they'd dominate and they'd probably give way to mugwort, which likes sun more. In the short term, string trimming it down, because both garlic mustard and stiltgrass are annuals. Garlic mustard is a biennial. It'll be seeding right now. So if you string trim it down multiple times aggressively before it puts its seeds out, when it gets hot, it'll go dormant. The stiltgrass pops up and puts its seed out in the second week of August. So if you string trim it down in July and August a couple times, you'll keep it from producing seed. And then eventually, in the next 35 years of doing that, you'll deplete the seed bank and you won't have any problems. And the wineberry and stuff like that, if you just cut it back, it doesn't persist. It can't handle. The big thing is with the cutting and the removal mechanically is you need to put something back. I recommend like aggressive native species that spread by root. So that'd be like bee balm or monarda is a really great fill-in. Mountain mint, Pygnanthemum muticum would be really aggressive. Actually, this is monarda in the photo, and you can see that it's very aggressive. If you give it some sun, it just runs. Those two plants will push a lot of stuff out, and they'll actually fight each other out. They'll probably keep back mugwort as well. And part of that is they spread by their roots. They spread by seed, about 4 to 5 feet tall, so they suffocate everything else from getting sunlight. Those would be my two go-to, especially if you view it from above. They're going to be really beautiful.
And how do you get rid of Pachysandra?
Oh my God. I told someone a few years ago, they were like, how do you get rid of nimblewill? And I was like, oh, that's easy. You just sell your property. Pachysandra is just constant weeding, pulling it out. Strangely enough, we did have really good success spraying it with herbicide in January, which was really weird. We just sprayed it in January and it sat all winter, and then come February it all died. But the problem with Pachysandra that's why I say mechanically pull it out and get the roots and everything out, is because Pachysandra has a waxy cuticle on its leaves, so it makes the herbicide not get absorbed by the plant, so it can't really be killed by Roundup or these other things. And when you pull it out and you leave a little rootlet, like a 1/4 inch, that's a whole another plant that'll grow from it. The system runs underground, so it's virtually impossible. Unfortunately, like, mechanical method's a really good way to start. Hand pull as much as you can, mulch that area really heavily. I have seen some people mow it down with like a little push mower and a bagger, and then lay out cardboard and mulch on top of that. Again, it's very labor intensive, and it doesn't always work. I've seen people do it with fabric as well, and then I saw Pachysandra poke out the side. I was like, what? It's been here for 1.5 years, and the Pachysandra's like, oh, yeah, I'm gonna go over here now.
And thank you so much. If you don't mind, I'm sure people will come up to you
I'm gonna be here for
and
a bit.
chat. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, guys.
This presentation was recorded, so if you know of people who weren't able to make it today, you can tell them to check the library's YouTube channel for this presentation or watch it again yourselves.